Hello, welcome to another session of my chats on the Change Exchange, where we talk about change. We talk about moments of change in life, about moments when our life paths suddenly take a different direction. Sometimes it's choice, sometimes it's decision after long and hard thought. Sometimes life forces it on you. And today, my guest is Iman Rappetti. We know her as journalist, but she says she's moved on, and we'll talk about that. Iman, welcome. Thank you for giving time.
Ruda, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. You and I haven't spoken directly, I think, in a long time, if ever. So this is a real privilege for me, and it's my absolute pleasure being with you and your audience today.
Thank you. You know, we usually start with the professional side of one's life under the heading landing that job. But if I think of change in your life, I have to start with religion because it's also interwoven with your professional journey. You grew up as a charismatic Christian to the extent that you would go out on the streets and convert people and then change to Islam. How come?
Yeah, I mean, when I look back and I always hear people ask me that question, in hindsight, I realize at the time, at the age I was, how revolutionary that would have been in my own life. And a lot about that time was really facing myself. We face ourselves at various junctures in our lives. We ask really hard questions at epiphanic moments. And that was one of mine, the transition between two major monotheistic faiths, very similar and starkly different in many ways. And it took a lot of courage to follow where my faith led at the time. It was a
How old were
brilliant journey.
you?
It was a bruising journey.
How old were you? You were quite young. You were quite
I
young.
was 22, 23, around there.
So what started it off?
I think a lot of us go through life where you kind of follow a path that's been mapped out for you. You follow the programming of your environment, and your journey is set. I tried always to question my context. And so as much as I loved Christianity, and as you may have read in my book or heard elsewhere, it was a really deeply personal and sincere journey for me. But there were questions inside the house of that religion that I had to ask myself. And it's that series of questions that created the platform of transition for me into Islam, which is also a very difficult faith to follow because you pray all day long, you're fasting, you're depriving yourself, you're in civic duty all the time, not unlike Christianity in many ways. But it was tough, but I followed my own conscience is the simple answer.
And then you decided to go and live in Iran, at least for a while. Why and how?
I am such a believer in things unfolding. I'm not a huge planner into the future, Ruda. So when I became Muslim, I didn't know where that journey was going to lead. I just knew that wherever my heart was beating the hardest, that's the direction I would follow. That would be my compass point. And so I wanted to learn more about Islam, obviously. I wanted to learn it in another country, and the opportunity presented itself to go and learn in Qum, which is a village about 250 kilometers outside the capital, Tehran. And it was such a change, Ruda. Different language, different culture, different religion. Everything in my life had changed, but it was beautiful.
If you say the opportunity presented itself, how did it happen?
So let me tell you a funny story. I think we all remember Felicia Mabuza Sattel. She was like the doyen of talk back in the 90s. And I happened to be on her show about Islam, and I was defending the faith and talking about women's place in Islam and so on. And the next day, I happened to phone an institution. There was a Shia institution. So there are two schisms or two sort of major houses in Islam, the Shia and the Sunni school of thought. And I was very fascinated by what had happened in Iran vis-a-vis their religious revolution in 79. So I happened to just phone this institution, and the guy who answered was the head of the institution, who was Iranian, and had seen me on the program the previous night, was fired up by my own story. Long story short, came to my house with a carpet under his arms and a box of Islamic tapes under the other and said, "Would you like to go to Iran?" I was newly married, and the answer was yes.
And your husband?
He was similar to me, Ruda, my husband at the time, because I've been divorced for about 10 years now. He was Catholic, then had Adventist influences in his Christian faith, also on a very similar parallel journey to me. And that's how our planets aligned, our paths converged, and we both ended up in this holy city called Qom in Iran.
And you worked there as a journalist. You, to take a step back, you started working at Capital Radio. But you wanted to study law, actually, but there was no money, so you got a job at a radio, right?
No, so how it happened was one day, well, I tried to go to university, but my father had passed away not long before I'd made that decision. We couldn't afford it. Found my mother on her knees polishing the floor one morning and said, Mom, I've got to study. Mom, I've got to study. Do something. Got to do something. She said, well, we don't have the money. So we made a plan, and tech was obviously, in those days, a much cheaper option. And then I ended up enrolling in journalism and getting my half-finished journalism diploma. But and then I put everything on hold for this journey, right? This journey of discovery to Iran. And when I got there, there was a need for a producer at the IRIB, which is their outside broadcast. It's the broadcasting central in Iran, but they have an outside broadcast in English. And so I did radio and television there. It's so weird how it happens, because I go from Qom, studying religion, to the capital, working in broadcast.
How did you experience that in a Muslim country, with the position of women? Now you were at least a little boss, and how did the men respond?
It was interesting because so in order to answer that question, you have to understand the context of Iran at that time. After the revolution, an 8-year war with Iraq breaks out. A lot of men go to war. Women are running the home. They are literally keeping the fiber of that society together. So their power is already scaffolded during those important years. And at the end of that conflict, women in Iran, I mean, a lot of people would say, are the matriarchs, they're the heads of the family in many ways. Contrary to some Middle Eastern countries and the experience of women there. Judging by the news we hear today about a lot of the freedoms that women, especially young women, are seeking in Iran, the battle for a kind of living inside this country, defined by the younger generation, is still being waged, and it's still on. At that time, I was not barred from any gatherings. In fact, just the other day, I was showing someone a picture of me reading my poetry to the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei.
But did you have to, having grown up quite a sassy young girl, a little girl, I would imagine, did you have to adapt the way you present yourself? Yes?
It's a no-brainer, of course. You're living in a Muslim country, and I go from wearing what I like to,
Yes.
covering up in a certain way. But at that point, I think I was at the height of my spiritual concentration. So how to dress, where to go, didn't really bother me as much as wanting to understand the philosophy. So that accoutrement of religion was really secondary for me. However, I remember in our flat in Qom, we had a philosophy lecturer, and all the men would come, and we'd have one of these lectures at my home. And I was like, where do you expect me to sit? They were like, well, you can't, necessarily be with us. I'm like, well, this is my house. I'm not going anywhere. So that's how it happened, that I ended up being one of the only women there, and one of my other friends as well, another lady, managed to also squeeze in, and we sat in on that class. So, in whichever ways we could, we decided what our fate was going to be.
And you had your first baby there. How does a pregnant woman, how does society interact with pregnancy, if I can ask it that way?
Of course. Listen, the reason I'm giggling, Ruda, is because, I'm realizing how difficult your task must be, interviewing another journalist who has a lot to say. And we've both been in environments where you have to curb the person that you're interviewing. There's so much enthusiasm for the topic. So pardon my enthusiasm. Obviously, obviously at that stage I couldn't speak much of the language. So I would get things wrong, and it would be a source of great hilarity, to people taking care of me. But the society itself, the people are so warm, especially in the place that I lived. So helpful, so caring. And family is really the center of the home.
And then you decided to come back. Why? How?
So, this is where the story sort of gets a little bit difficult. Right from the beginning of my marriage, there was talk of, whether, polygamy would be part of our reality or not. And I was very definitely, not going to be a sister wife, so to speak. And so when my second child, and that conversation had started just after the birth, or even before the birth of my first child. So by the time the second one was going to come around, I was like, I need to change my context here. I need to go back to where I feel I can be in more control of my environment. And so the journey back to South Africa, was initiated, and we moved back in, I think it was January of 2000.
Sorry, I'm not quite understanding. So did your husband say that he wanted to take a second wife? And in Iran, you wouldn't have a choice about that?
No, you do. You definitely have a choice in Iran about co-wives and things like that. In fact, there's a great deal of strictness around that engagement and securing the first wife's permission. However, it's a discretionary theme, if you know what I'm saying. It's not, in different countries, you may not have a choice about that. For me personally, it was a discussion that we were having that greatly discomforted me and distressed me from the very beginning. And so, when I thought it might actually become more real in those early years, I decided I need to change my context and move. Not that it's ever, it's not imposed on you in that country now.
And you came back to South Africa, and you thought you would just easily walk into a job, and it didn't happen. Tell me what happened.
It's a no-brainer. I had a radio show, I had an English language television show that was broadcast in Iran. I think it was every Friday or something. I came back, I remember, and this is in the old days, Heruda, you send an email to, and I remember mailing ETV. And in hindsight, have a bit of schadenfreude and say, they could have had me years ago. They only had me like 10 years later, or 7 years later or something. It wasn't easy. That year was not easy.
And so how did you get your first job back in South Africa?
So it took me probably about 6 or 7 months, and money was running out, and, the mood was kind of, really low because a lot was happening.
Where were you? Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban?
I was in KZN, in Durban, where I'm from. Yeah, living with my mother-in-law at the time, small space with her dogs, and we're Muslim, and you can't have dog hair on you when you're praying, and there was a lot of tension in the air, so to speak. But she was lovely. She opened up her door to us. So it took about 6 months. I don't know if you remember Stephen Lang. I think he's now editor of a newspaper down in Grahamstown. He was the guy who hired me. I'd heard that there were vacancies. SABC was launching a new online platform. With stitches in my body after having delivered my child, I bought a greyhound, come up to Johannesburg. Stephen, with his red socks, very graciously says, you have all the skills, and we think that's fantastic. Love your story. Can you start next week? And I did.
And your baby, how did you handle that?
And so I suppose this is where it all connects, hey, Ruda. All of these simultaneous changes that are happening in your body, in your life, in your journey as a human being. What do you do in a time of simultaneous change? And my default is always to become incredibly calm, to defer to sensibility and pragmatism, and to really avoid any kind of panic. And so that's what I did at that time. The first job was to find a place to stay, which we were graciously gifted with by someone in our community, in the Muslim community, very giving community, Shia community here in Johannesburg. And then just got on with doing it, starting my life again in our country, changing everything and making long-term decisions about both my faith and my marriage.
There was a point when you were working so hard that you were burning out. A morning show on radio, an evening show on television, and it just all got too much. That's a very difficult decision to make, to say, I must dial down. I must give up some of my what I'm achieving. Actually, it's almost a contradictory thing.
When we exist with the echo of our parents' expectation ringing in our ears, and then our heart beats with our own expectation of ourselves. And there's sometimes a tension between those two things, and especially when you grow up in an apartheid society like we did, where the only way out of any sort of poverty or ill circumstance was education and being successful in your job. I'd always been defined by that, quietly thinking about the standards and expectations of my mom and my dad and my community. So being so driven by that to the point where I was, and reaching what I thought was a real pinnacle in my career, a sense of accomplishment. I didn't have to apply for jobs anymore. People would phone me up and say, can you do this or that? Feeling really accomplished in myself. Yes. And then at the same time, realizing that all those dead bodies that I'd seen, all those protests that I'd covered, all the machinations that were happening in our country were taking its own kind of toll on my mental health and on my emotional well-being. And then deciding, what is it do I want from my life, really? You know, I've ticked as many of the boxes as I can. It's time to let go and see, in a journey of not knowing what the destination was going to be, how things might unfold.
How did you do it in practice? Did you have a little bit of money saved and you just gave yourself X months that you could look after yourself? Or what did you do?
Oh, I relate so much to the practical question that you're raising, because I know in reading about your own, you know, having after carte blanche, how we figure out how we're going to pay for things. I had made up my mind, Ruda, to break that mold where money would decide how free I would or wouldn't be. So I just decided, okay, that is the life of my design and my desire. And that's what I'm going to pursue. Everything else must fall into place. And I know some people might say, oh, that's such a privileged perspective, because actually, if you don't get a check, how are you going to pay the electricity? How are you going to send your kids to school? And I'd put my kids to private school and, you know, really try to be a good mom, give them a good, beautiful home. But it's strange that when you decide that that's going to be your design, things really do fall into place. Mm-hmm. I was calmer, able to be more creative, to think more, to tap into other creativities that had ossified over time. I'm starting to water that garden again. And I'm still in my home. Nothing's been repossessed. The kids are still at school. So I think there's something here in that release.
So how do you pay the bills? What do you do?
So right now, so I just left. I had another radio stint at Power, a station that I really loved, and I joined in because Bob Ben had passed. I thought I'd just help them over the hump, so to speak, and the grief. Then they offered me a more longer term thing, which I really didn't want at this point. So I run my own agency, and it's wonderful because we decide the kinds of things we want to do. So we say, okay, we want to make a film. What's the film going to be about? Okay, cool. We're going to devote some time to that. Then we're going to help people, do better in their public presentation. We're going to help people who owe the public information, give that information in a far more effective way. So it's all of those things. And I'm having a great deal of fun. And hopefully, Ruda, I'm going to write my third book, a book that I truly, truly want to write, that is about deep meaning.
Tell me about writing Becoming Iman. How did you experience the writing? It's very open, it's very personal. When you were writing, did it start out as a journal and then become something more public, or what was the approach?
So it was so interesting. I was speaking to the MD of Pan Macmillan. I'd done Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneki's book launch. And I said to Terry Morris, I've been writing these sermons in the morning to my listeners. I think, you might like them. So we sat down, we had a meeting, and then she was like, sermons are great, but Iman, we want to know about your life story. What's it been like? And that's how Becoming Iman was born. It was never meant to be the first book.
So did you then have to start writing that story? You didn't have that on paper yet, or on screen?
To tell you the truth, I didn't even have a clue about how I was going to begin. I've always been a good writer. I've always written over time, but writing a book is something, it's a different challenge. And what I decided to do was to follow my old formula, which is when the spirit awakens you right in that moment, because there is a texture and a dressing that doesn't exist when you say, I'm writing at 8 a.m. every morning. So I'm not a writer of discipline. You wake up in the morning and put something on paper. I let my heart be open, and whatever chooses to come and take up a spot in the armchair, that's what's being written about that day.
And the experience, once the book was out there, the experience of being known so intimately.
Ruda, it is so amazing to write a book and to have book launches, because this is the stuff of a little girl's fantasies. This is the stuff of imagination and dreams. Am I going to be an author? When I was growing up, I remember some part of me would have this idea of, because I wanted to be free in the world. So I'd be smoking this sort of long French cigarette, it kind of
those were the days.
Something. I have a very old soul in that way, and a little bit theatric, as I'm sure you've gained from this interview. But it was magical having people come, and people bought my book and they enjoyed it, and the feedback was amazing, and mostly appreciated the contrast, that it's not all this glitzy, glamoury TV life that we have led. There's life happening. There are divorces happening. There are children with problems happening. There are, pieces of this tapestry that you have to keep interwoven. You have to stay sane. You have to hold everything together. And that for me has been such a beautiful triumph in my own journey.
And then you did finally manage to get your morning sermons out there in Sermons of the Soul. What is that experience been like? It's recent, huh?
So Sermons was published in, I think it was March or May of last year. And obviously we couldn't do the whole roadshow like we did with the first book and so on. But the feedback's been so wonderful from people who liked it on the radio and are now able to engage a little bit more. And funnily enough, even though I divorced her son 10 years ago, my former mother-in-law has made this journal based on the sermon, saying which parts really resonated. And so many women said, these particular chapters just really spoke to my soul. And that, again, is just such a beautiful gift, Ruda.
That's wonderful to get that kind of feedback, that people not only read your stuff, but that they respond from within. That's really great.
And that's wonderful, because if we have the attitude that whatever we do is about sharing insights with other people, it's not about giving people the answer, because the answer does not exist. It is your answer. But if we can provide keys for unlocking, create a beautiful table for people to dine at freely, and to allow their thoughts to be feral, that is the triumph, I think, of any kind of work that we do, writing that we do, anything that we put out in the world. What is it spark in another human being, and what do they put back in that space?
Yeah. Tell me about your experience of COVID in December. It sounds as if it was really frightening.
Yeah, it really was awful. And when I think about, we've lost two colleagues recently, Karima Brown, who's really well known, and Dr. Cindy van Zyl, also very well known. I worked with Karima at eNCA, and Cindy had interviewed me, and I'd interviewed her, and she was just really a beautiful human being. So we got sick, and then obviously if you get a sniffle in these times, you're like, oh my gosh, it must be, it must be COVID.
I must get tested.
So sure enough, we'd gone, and I remember sitting in the drive-through thinking, oh my God, I can't believe, I'm getting tested for COVID, and getting the results the next day. Our holiday had to be canceled. We were about to leave the day we got our results. We had to cancel everything. And then struggling that weekend till the Sunday when I knew that I was in trouble. Couldn't breathe, and my daughter insisted, let's go to the hospital. So, 6 days stay there. You think you're in hospital, you should be getting progressively better. And I would get a little bit better, then my infection levels would spike, and my temperature would spike, and everything was just crazy. It was really scary. It was really anxiety inducing, and I really considered whether or not I would make it back home to my children.
Both my son and my nephew were in hospital also over December, January.
Oh,
And
no.
my nephew said to me that it felt as if he was breathing through a wet cloth in a steamed up shower.
Wow. It's really, it's your lungs. I mean, your fundamental mode of breathing. And I would get off the bed and walk, try to walk, just so that I could keep my lungs moving, because I didn't want to end up in ICU. And there was such a beautiful lady there. I wish I'd gotten her name, but we were all so sick. And I remember going to the bathroom, heaving, not being able to make it back onto my bed, and I started crying. And she said to me, you know, don't worry, you're going to make it out of here alive. And that really, and she was praying. And I mean, even though I'm irreligious right now, I don't want to say God as such, because, you know, what is God? But I don't believe that there's something out there. But I take the energy from that prayer, and I really received it. And I, you know, bless that lady, whomever she is.
Mm-hmm. And it was also about your children, the worry for them. How old are they? Between 12 and 18, right?
So they moved up a little bit. My youngest bear is 14, and Mohammed's 23, and Miriam is 21. So the two older ones understood what was happening. And of course, I had a heart issue a couple of months ago as well. Really concerned. But I'm so glad that our family is intact. And I know that there are so many South Africans and people around the world whose families are not, and my heart just really goes out to them. Life has just changed for them.
Mm-hmm. What do your children mean to you? How did they change you, affect you?
Yeah, nou gaan die trane aankom. I don't know if I said that correctly, because Afrikaans is not my first language, Ruda. But here's the funny thing. You know, we often joke, and I say to him, you know, I'm not really the marrying kind, not really the mothering kind. And if you guys ever think about that, really think twice. It's not easy. Having said that, they are the most incredible human beings, because they keep me honest. They say, but you said, so you need to do. So they really keep you honest. But also, they're just so beautiful. So they keep me really young as well. I mean, you can ask me about hip hop, Ruda darling. You can ask me about, you know, the latest social media trends and the TikToks and whatever. I know it all, because I have these fresh, connected young children, you know, and they're beautiful. They just, they make me appreciate that life is, it's not all about the linear stuff. It's not all about the practical stuff. There's so much joy in between the margins.
When I read that you also had, I had the same experience with I only have one child. And
that's JP. No, JP's your husband, Johannes.
JP's my husband. My son has the same names, but we call him Johannes.
Yeah.
And I also had an emergency Caesar. And then waking up with this baby. And I said when Johannes turned 21, I said at that gathering that my insides melted and it's never returned to normal. It's completely irrational and indescribable.
Totally. I mean, at least I have a waistline. Let me step back a little bit so you can see, you know, I've managed to maintain, some semblance of sophistication, you know, and a body with curves. But that moment, and you're right, the very first delivery, the very first pregnancy, and of course, going back to Iran, that's where mine happened. It was very traumatic. I was in this hospital in a strange place. But when Mohammed came, it was the most amazing thing to know that I had a hand in creating this life. And I remember all of his milestones. And it does, I don't know if you're tearing up there or is it just the lights, but it makes me want to tear up also just to think about, you know, who he has become. And he's such a gentle heart, Ruda. He's the most beautiful soul. And the world is not created in a way that nurtures free-spiritedness, in a way that really nurtures otherness. You know, and I'm really trying to teach my children that wherever they are, in whatever environment, is to have open arms and open minds to whomever they encounter, in whatever situation they face.
Because you have to come out of your box. You know, I think we are all, our first families create a box. in which you live with people who are like you and like your parents. And so your school friends have similar backgrounds usually. These days, I think the kids actually have an advantage because often they are with schoolmates who are not like from their cultural background. And I think that's an enormous advantage. But I grew up with a very homogeneous, what's the word, homogeneous background. And I also had to come out of that box. And for you to make that easy, make that the logical thing to do for your children, I think that's wonderful.
Thank you for that, Ruda. And the reason it is so is because we understand the pain that ignorance wreaks on the world. You could love someone who the law will not allow you to love, and how much unnecessary pain is that causing? You could love, across the color line or whatever. All these notions of separation that we have, whether it's language, class, ethnicity, are so unnecessary when we should be here for the human experience, for creating a world in which all of our gifts are allowed to thrive. Some people will say, oh, that's so utopian and it's so, it's so naive. But if we can't believe in that and we continue to perpetuate the things that keep us divided and keep us ignorant, we will never have a world in which we can truly just live and experience the beauty of this planet that we live on.
On a very practical level, how did you choose this lovely place where you're living? What makes you choose your space? Do you look for light? Do you look for trees? Do you look for space? Okay. What is most important?
Let me take you on a little tour. Now, my room is untidy, but untidy before I interview, I chucked everything on the bed. But I am a steady creature. So I have a 4-poster bed with muslin because I like to sleep in comfort. The garden is just behind me, and it's lush and it's green and it's beautiful. There will always be candles in my home. There will always be flowers, and there will always be some beautiful scent. Because I do think, and I know, Ruda, I'm so aware that this is not possible for everyone. I know that, and I really appreciate my space because I believe that despite a lot of the hurdles, I've managed to accomplish this, without an inheritance or anything like that. I've done it, and I feel proud of myself for doing that. But it's possible wherever we are to have a moment of peace, and we should try to seek out those opportunities for peace. Because if we experience it just in one cupful, soon we'll have a reservoir of it around us.
So what is the best thing about getting home from a gig or a big job, or I don't know what these days, what is the best thing about closing the computer?
Well, the best thing about our moment right now is that I can do it barefoot. And don't worry, I'm fully clothed.
Me too.
But I can do it barefoot. But coming home gives me a way to separate and to enforce the boundary between being fully connected and charged and plugged in, to being able to just be still and to allow myself to understand what I feel about things. Not always carrying sort of our national duty in our hands as the first thing. Just to sit quietly and think about myself and whether I'm still doing the right thing, and how's my heart.
So you do carry the national duty? Do you think in those terms? I think the country so needs people who do that.
I think so. I think whether you're working as a journalist or whatever you're doing inside South Africa, our fates are all intertwined. And if we're not thinking about that, then what are we thinking about? But obviously with people like ourselves who have access to a platform and thousands or perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, it is a slightly different thing because we have the ability to hold people to account and to say, but why? Please explain, I do feel it because I love this place and I don't want to think about living anywhere else, Ruda. This is our home, and it's got to be a home for everyone who lives in it.
Thank you so much. That's a lovely note to end on. It was great talking to you, and have a wonderful day.
Ruda, you're such a darling. If I could, I would just break off one of those roses and hand it to you through this medium that we're talking in today. But thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. And I'm sending a lot of love into your space and to your family. Be safe, and to the entire team as well. And to everyone who listens to this interview, thank you so much. And may your day be blessed and rich.
Absolutely, I can only second that. Go well, Goodbye.